Hey friends, Matt here, and in this video what I want to do is show you how you can make your vocals sound awesome using only stock Ableton Live devices. So to keep this fair for everyone, I'm going to use devices that only come with every single edition of Ableton Live, all the way from Light through to Suite, so that no matter what edition you're working with, you can follow along. Now, of course, if you have extra EQs, compressors, auto tunes, whatever, feel free to use them, but follow this as a template to process your vocals to get them sounding really nice and clean. Okay, so first off, this is the vocal we're going to be working with. It is not very well recorded and it is not very well sung. I'm not a fantastic singer, but this is what it sounds like. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And this is what we're going to be turning it into. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Cool. So before we get started with actually putting any processing on these vocals, we're going to do one thing first. This is a really important step if you want a nice, consistent level for your vocal across the entirety of your track, and that is go ahead and manually control the volume fluctuations in the recording. In order to do this, we're going to use clip gain. Now, you could do this with something like Wave's Vocal Writer or any of these automatic leveling plugins, but we're going to do this manually because you might not have access to some of those fancy plugins. So in order to do this in Ableton Live, all we're going to do is find the areas that are really loud and peaky compared to the rest of the recording. So for instance, I can see here we have a really loud section. I'm going to go ahead and select this, split this with Command or Control and E, open up my clip view with Shift and Tab, and just reduce the gain of this. Let's just make this view here a little bit smaller until we kind of are in line a little bit with the rest of the recording. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is just fade these clips into each other by zooming in, grabbing the fade handles up the top so that it's a nice smooth transition. And this is just going to get the vocal sounding a little bit more nice and consistent in terms of level. I can see the light. Now, if it's too much of a dip in volume like it was there, we can just adjust the level to be a little bit higher. And it's worth noting that what it looks like is not always going to be what it ends up sounding like. So although it might look relatively even, it might still sound a little bit too quiet or too loud, depending on how far away the singer was from the microphone, etc. So it's always worth using your ears for this step as well. I can see the light. Now, the more precise you are with this, generally speaking, the better, although it is possible to overdo it. For the sake of this, we really don't have to go super into depth or into detail with this. We can just kind of do it a bit more broad strokes. So I've gone ahead here and done this to a few more sections across the vocal, just pulling down the level of some really loud parts. And now we have something that sounds a little bit more consistent. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And the reason for doing this is so that the compressors we're going to be using are not going to be working as hard, so that they can be more transparent in their compression. We're going to get to this later on down the line. So next, you might want to apply some tuning to your vocals. Now, you can do this tuning manually using something like Melodyne, or you can use it automatically using something like Auto Tune. Here in Ableton Live, if you're using Ableton Live 12.1, we can use the Auto Shift device. If you're not using Ableton Live 12.1 and you don't have access to Auto Shift, there are some free options such as M Auto Pitch or Allbone Sounds Greylon 2, which I'll leave links to down below. So here I've added Auto Shift to the track, and all we need to go ahead and do is just select the scale that this vocal is in. In our case here, it's F sharp minor. So by setting it to F sharp minor, all the notes outside of the key have been turned off, so it's only going to snap the vocal to notes that are inside the key. Next, all we need to do is adjust the strength of the tuning, how fast it tunes to our liking, and then we're good to go. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Trapped inside my mind, somewhere I won't be found. Awesome. Now, of course, you don't need to tune your vocals depending on how well the vocals were sung or the type of music you're working with, but it is a good idea, particularly if you're working in electronic music or pop music, to add a little bit of auto tuning to get that kind of more crisp, clean feel that is common in a lot of more modern recordings. Next up, we're going to add some subtractive EQ. This subtractive EQ is going to do two things. It's going to remove the low frequencies with a filter, and it's also going to attenuate some frequencies that may be a little bit boomy or resonant consistent in the vocal recording before we start to compress the vocal to get it a little bit more consistent in terms of level. Now, of course, you can use any EQ for this that you like. However, again, to keep things fair and simple, I'm going to use two different things. I'm going to use auto filter for the filtering, and I'm going to use channel EQ, which is the kind of simple EQ that comes in all editions of Ableton Live. So here I've added an auto filter to the track. I'm going to go ahead and set this to a high pass filter and then set the frequency here to around kind of 80 to 100 hertz. Now, this range will vary depending on the particular vocal that you're working with, but in general, what this is doing is just removing some kind of boomy low frequencies, maybe some plosives or something like that, to help get a little bit more of a clean vocal sound. We want this to be a nice transparent filtering. We don't want it to be too intense. I can see the light. A good guide here is to listen to the vocal and increase the frequency control as you're playing it until where you can hear that filter take effect, and then just back it off slightly. I can see the light, but there's no way out. So around that kind of 95 to 100 hertz mark is good here for this filter. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and add a channel EQ. And this channel EQ, I'm gonna use to just control some of that boominess and muddiness in the vocal. Because this was recorded with a laptop microphone, it's got a lot of kind of low, mid, muddy frequencies in there. So in order to reduce these, what I'm gonna go ahead and do is use the mid band of the channel EQ, set it to kind of around 5 to 700 hertz, and just reduce the mid frequencies slightly. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Trapped inside my mind, somewhere I won't be found. Now, if you have some extra resonances or anything in the vocals, this is also a good time to reduce the level of those resonances by finding them in a more surgical EQ, something like EQ8 or FabFilter Pro Q, and just reducing the level of them in there. But next up, let's go and add some compression. So when compressing this vocal, again, what we're trying to do is do two things. We're going to try and reduce the level of the peaks, which are these really loud, short bits in time here that we can see across the vocal, and then control the level of it more generally across the entirety of the vocal recording. And once again, to do this, we're gonna use two different compressors. First, we're gonna start with a very fast compressor. Now, you could use just a typical compressor, but for this, I'm actually gonna use a limiter or Ableton Live's limiter. So let's go ahead and add limiter here to this vocal track. And then all I'm gonna do is just reduce the ceiling of the limiter device until we're just catching or reducing the level of these really loud peaks that we can see here in this vocal. I can see the light, but there's no way out. I'm also gonna set the release here to be quite quick so that we don't get a lot of pumping with this limiter. I can see the light. And we can see there that just on those really high peaky bits, we're getting quite a decent amount of gain reduction, but no gain reduction across the rest of the vocal track, which is what we want. Now you go ahead then and listen to most of your vocal track, find where those loud peaky bits are, and then just make sure that the ceiling is sitting nicely across everything. And this is the reason why we went ahead and did all of that manual kind of gain staging at the beginning, is to get the vocal at a consistent level before we start applying this limiting, because otherwise this limiter is going to be working overtime on some phrases and really not at all on others, which is going to create an inconsistent listening experience. Next, now that we've got that peak limiter out of the way, let's go ahead and add our more slow general compression to this vocal. For this, I'm going to use Ableton Live's standard compressor, and we're going to change a few settings here. Instead of being on peak mode, I'm going to switch it to RMS mode, which is basically just a more average compression. Instead of using the actual loudest bit of the signal in order to trigger the compressor, we're using the average level instead, which gives us a little bit more control over a kind of smoother general compression. Once we've got this, I'm going to reduce the threshold until we're applying compression on pretty much the entirety of the vocal phrase here. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Trapped inside my mind, somewhere I won't be found. Now here I'm looking for around 2 to 5 decibels of gain reduction on average, which we can see is kind of what we're hitting. And then we can adjust this later using the ratio, knee, attack, and release controls to taste. So now that we've got this, I'm gonna set my attack and release controls here. And because we want this to be more smooth compression, I'm actually gonna set a slower attack time and a slower release time as well, so that we're just kind of gently applying compression across the entirety of the vocals. If we want to be able to see this a little bit better, we can also actually switch to our activity view to see this compression over time instead of just with meters, which can be a little bit more useful. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And now I've set our attack and release times, we can play around with our threshold, maybe reduce the ratio if we want a little bit less compression. And I also recommend increasing the knee to be a bit softer. Somewhere between 6 and 10 dB for a knee is pretty good when applying this particular type of more soft compression. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Next, what we want to do just to keep things a little bit more consistent in terms of gain is take a look at the average gain reduction. In this case, it's around 3 to 5 dB, and then just increase the output level of the compressor to compensate for that gain reduction. So I'm just going to increase the output here by 3 dB so that we've got a more consistent level. And again, if you go back and adjust this compressor, just beware to adjust this output gain as well. So I played around for a little bit, and these are the settings that I came up with for this compressor in this particular instance. A little bit of a faster attack, slower release, and a ratio of about 3 to 1, and the threshold set there. Now, if we wanted more compression, we'd just increase the ratio. If we wanted less compression, we could decrease the ratio, but I kind of liked it at around 3 or 4 to 1. Next, now that we've evened out the level of this vocal over time, what we're gonna go ahead and do is just enhance it tonally by using some more EQ. This time, instead of using a lot of subtractive EQ like we did before the compression, we're going to use some more additive EQ to enhance the aspects of the vocal that we like. So once again, you could use any EQ for this. Something like EQ8 is great if you have access to it, or FabFilter Pro Q3. In this instance, we're going to use channel EQ, again, just to keep it fair for everyone. So here I've got a channel EQ, and first what I want to do is add some more presence to these vocals. So I'm going to increase the high frequencies. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And then I'm going to start to address the mid situation here. I'm going to push up the mids a little bit at around 1 to 2000 hertz. And this is going to increase the kind of intelligibility of the vocals. I can see the light, but there's no way out. I'm also going to reduce the low band here just a little bit. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And now I just want to add a little bit more EQ. So I'm going to go ahead and add another channel EQ because this channel EQ is fairly limited, only being 3 bands. And we can now use this second mid band here to kind of apply some more EQ around this 700 to 1000 hertz mark. I can see the light. I'm just going to reduce the level of around that region a little bit. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And you can then start to play around with these EQs to taste. But in this particular instance, we're not trying to EQ this vocal to fit within the context of a mix. We're trying to EQ it to make it sound nice. That's important to remember. There's a difference between EQing and adjusting the tonal balance of the vocal to sound nice in and of itself, and then adjusting it to sound good in the context of a mix. That's a kind of different video entirely. In this instance, we're actually just trying to adjust the tone of the vocal to sound good when listened to in isolation, which is going to translate well to the context of a mix, but with a few tweaks needed here and there. By the way, if you're not super familiar with how all these different types of effects such as EQs and compressors work, I actually have a whole online course that takes you through not only how EQs and compressors and things like reverb and delay work, but also just how the process of music making works in general to get you to create your own music using Ableton Live. If you want to learn more about that course, you can check it out at courses.matttinklermusic.com. There'll be a link in the description. Okay, so now that we've adjusted the tonal balance of the vocal to just sound a little bit nicer, we're going to go ahead and add some de-essing to reduce the harshness of some of those sibilant sounds like S's and F's, etc. in the vocal recording. Now, if you don't know what de-essing is, I have a whole video that goes through 5 different ways that you can apply de-essing, which you can check out on the link on the screen somewhere. But for this, we're going to use Ableton Live's standard compressor to do our de-essing for us. So to set this up, all we need to do is add a compressor, and open up the sidechain tab using this arrow in the top left, click on the EQ button, and then change the filter type to a bandpass EQ. Next, what I'm going to do is turn on this little sidechain listen device and then increase or change the frequency control here until I start to hear those really sibilant and harsh frequencies come through. I know that there's some harsh frequencies here in this first phrase and in this second phrase, so that's kind of what I'm going to be listening for. We can increase the Q as well, and if we want to be able to see this a little bit better, we can also again switch to the activity view to see the jump in level of those particular frequency ranges that we're isolating. I can see the light, but there's no way out. So in this instance, those kind of harsher frequencies are around that 5K mark. So I'm going to leave this here, increase the Q a little bit, and now turn off this sidechain listen. And now all we need to do is just reduce the threshold, set our attack and release to something relatively quick, maybe increase the release a little bit, and then we can adjust. And now we just want to make sure that those S sounds are being reduced by this compressor. I can see the light, but there's no way out. And then the level of this reduction is going to be controlled by the ratio control here. And if you want, you can play around with knee and stuff too, but that's it. Let's take a listen to without the compressor. I can see the light. Particularly on that C. Let's take a listen to with the compressor. I can see the light. And you can see and hear the effect of that compressor or that de-esser on the vocal there, reducing the level of that S in that word C. Now that covers the majority of the main processing of this vocal. From here, we can start to add some more spatial effects like delays and reverbs. Now, these are going to work better when listening in the context of a mix, but for the sake of it, let's just go ahead and add some delays and reverbs now to give this vocal just a little bit more space. Bear in mind though that if you are working with the vocal in the context of a mix, you'll probably need to adjust these to fit that context. To start with, let's go ahead and add some delay to these vocals. Now, delay is a great way to add some extra space and rhythmic interest to vocals. Let's go ahead and reduce the dry wet here, reduce the feedback, and then set the delay timing to something that works well with the rhythm of the vocals. Probably in this case, something like 2 or 4 here, rather 1/8 notes or quarter notes. I can see the light, but there's no way out. To stop this delay from getting in the way of the actual vocals as well, what I'm going to do is adjust the filter here to just isolate this delay into a more specific frequency range. Generally, this kind of middle here to this upper middle is a good place to start. And then we can also play around with stereoizing this delay a little bit by either switching it to ping pong mode or by just adjusting the offset of the left and the right sides. The right can be a little bit positive and the left can be a little bit negative. And now we're adding some stereoization to our delay. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Next, let's go ahead and add some reverb. And again, with the reverb, generally it's best to listen to it in the context of a whole mix, but we can go ahead and just reduce the dry wet a little bit here. And let's just add a little bit of kind of space to this vocal. Nothing too crazy or large. Let's go ahead and have a decay of around 1 second, decrease the size a little bit to maybe 80, and increase the pre-delay to about 10 milliseconds. And that should be a relatively good starting point. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Trapped inside my mind, somewhere I won't be found. Now, in the context of an actual mix, this might be longer, larger, smaller, shorter, whatever, but this is sounding pretty good for us for the moment. Now, a lot of the time, this is kind of where you can leave it and actually start working with the vocal in the context of a mix. But if you're working in more kind of dense pop or electronic music, it can also be a great idea to, again, add another limiter at the end of the chain here to just bring everything together once again, which is exactly what we're gonna do right now. So here, once again, I've just added another limiter, and all we're gonna do is bring down the ceiling, and all we're gonna do is bring down the ceiling until we're applying some compression or limiting, again, across pretty much the entirety of the vocal here. I can see the light, but there's no way out. Now in this instance, because the vocal is quite quiet going into the limiter, I'm also going to increase the input gain just a little bit so that we can get a little bit more control with the ceiling here. I'm also going to set the release here to auto mode so that the limiter can adjust its release automatically depending on the signal coming into it. And this can generally sound a little bit more transparent.
I can see the light, but there's no way out. Trapped inside my mind, somewhere I won't be found.
And that's pretty much it. From here, we can go back and finesse some of our devices. Maybe we could adjust the compression, adjust things like the EQ, adjust the spatial effects. We could even go back and apply something like a gate to remove these moments in between all of these different phrases, or we could simply go back and just remove these sections in the vocal that don't have anything playing. And you might even want to go back and adjust some of these gain. And you might even want to go back and adjust some of the clip gain of these different segments. For example, I think this segment goes down a little bit too quiet. So I'm going to bring this back up and then adjust the fade here so that it's a little bit more transparent at the end. And now we have a vocal that's going to be at a good stage for chucking into a mix and fitting within the context of a rest of a song. And there you have it. That is a tried and true method that you can use to process vocals and get good sounding results pretty much every single time. You can follow along with this in any single digital audio workstation that you're using. As long as you've got those certain devices such as a tuner, EQ, compressor, etc., you should be able to do this and follow along. Save this video, come back to it if you need it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.